In the second half of the 20th century, African American athletes not only gained acceptance in a more diversified America, they became sports icons. Yet in the tradition-rich sport of kings, known for its kaleidoscope of colors on the racetrack, the faces of jockeys tell another story, a story unique in American sports history. Latin Americans, such as all-time winning jockey Lafitte Pincay Jr., play important roles in racing. Female jockeys are becoming more prevalent. But in the modern racing era, black riders are few and far between. But surprisingly to many, African American jockeys dominated the first runnings of the Kentucky Derby in the late 1800s. Their accomplishments were largely ignored for almost a century, but their legacy runs deep in the sporting roots of Americana.
Well, they are the beginning. See, they always said that Jackie Robinson was the first black in sports, but he wasn't. African-American jockeys were the first in sports.
Who were these early American sports legends? And why did they virtually disappear from the track and the history books? Coming up, the Forgotten Heroes, the remarkable tale of African-American jockeys. In the second half of the 20th century, African American athletes not only gained acceptance in a more diversified America, they became sports icons. Yet in the tradition-rich sport of kings, known for its kaleidoscope of colors on the racetrack, the faces of jockeys tell another story, a story unique in American sports history. Latin Americans, such as all-time winning jockey Lafitte Pincay Jr., play important roles in racing. Female jockeys are becoming more prevalent. But in the modern racing era, black riders are few and far between. But surprisingly to many, African American jockeys dominated the first runnings of the Kentucky Derby in the late 1800s. Their accomplishments were largely ignored for almost a century, but their legacy runs deep in the sporting roots of Americana.
Well, they are the beginning. See, they always said that Jackie Robinson was the first black in sports, but he wasn't. African-American jockeys were the first in sports.
Who were these early American sports legends? And why did they virtually disappear from the track and the history books? Coming up, the Forgotten Heroes, the remarkable tale of African-American jockeys. Every important story requires a storyteller and a diligent researcher to sort out facts from myths. On the subject of African-American jockeys, both roles are played by Edward Hoteling, a Washington, D.C. television writer and producer. Hoteling has long been interested in racial injustice. In 1988, he conducted the controversial, racially charged interview that ended the TV career of sports oddsmaker and CBS analyst Jimmy the Greek Snyder. But as a native of Saratoga Springs, New York, a horse racing mecca, Hoteling is also a lifelong fan of thoroughbred racing. And while researching his book, They're Off on Saratoga History, Hoteling made a discovery that surprised him.
A lot of the winners of the earlier races were African Americans, and it had never been reported. I kept seeing all these names, and I said, how come I didn't know this? And looked further into it and saw that the role of the African Americans in early American sports was enormous and totally unreported. So I thought this would be a good book in itself.
Hoteling's next book, The Great Black Jockeys, was published in 1999 to critical acclaim, both from racing historians and activists for racial equality.
Living in Washington, I had the Library of Congress at my doorstep, which is a fabulous library. And so I was able to find all of the old newspaper, all of the old racing records, and not only there, but at the National Sporting Library in Middleburg, at the Keeneland Library in Kentucky, at the libraries at Saratoga. The whole story jumped off the pages.
The black influence in horse racing actually dates back to the 1600s and was tied to slavery.
What people don't realize is that the African American heritage in racing comes from West Africa. And it was a well-established racing tradition. When the slave trade begins, these talented people are simply brought to this country.
This was also the South. The horses came from the plantations and from horse farms.
The owners would buy these young boys just to take care of the stables, take care of the horses.
Many of these youngsters would have grown up on farms, would have started caring for the horses rather early, around the age 10 and 11.
Birthing, breeding, exercising, and everything. And then they also rode those horses in competition.
They had to be good at it to survive, but if they had the talent to be good at it, they also could get something out of that.
Any enslaved person who was directly related to profit-making had a pretty high status and was somewhat favored.
You have to think about these white plantation owners who would literally bet the farm on a horse race. Everything they had was on that black jockey.
So, to my mind, these were our first professional athletes, as opposed, say, to the white baseball players who turned up 200 years later.
Evidence suggests that slave jockeys rode for both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who was a youngster considered a career as a jockey. In the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson even had a White House racing stable.
This was sort of his golf, maybe. I mean, this was this president's sport. He loved it, and he did. He used slave jockeys.
When the Civil War destroyed racetracks in the South, the emphasis of the sport switched to northern states, with the exception, of course, of Kentucky. When the Kentucky Derby began in 1875, the influence of African Americans was evident. The first Derby winner, Aristides, was trained by Ansel Williamson and ridden by Oliver Lewis. That year, 13 of the 15 jockeys in the Derby were black. The third Derby was won by Baden Baden, ridden by 17-year-old William Walker, the son of slaves born on a horse farm. Walker actually began his career as a jockey in New York at age 11. Later in life, he became an advisor to Kentucky breeder John E. Madden. Alonzo Clayton was just 15 when he won the Derby in 1892. Another Derby-winning jockey was James Soup Perkins, thus nicknamed because whenever he was asked what he wanted for lunch, he replied, soup. Champion jockey Willie Sims is the only black jockey to win the Derby, Preakness Stakes, and Belmont Stakes, the races that today comprise the Triple Crown, although he won them in different years. Sims is credited with introducing the modern crouched riding style to England. In this country, Sims had a perfect 2-for-2 record in the Derby, and he remains the last black rider to win the Belmont Stakes in New York. In their era, the best African-American jockeys were nationally known sports figures, and perhaps the most celebrated of them all was Isaac Murphy.
Isaac Murphy emerges as a superstar. We might even think of him as Michael Jordan of his day.
I mean, he was the greatest rider, the greatest athlete of the century, everyone thought, and he was certainly the top athlete, the highest paid athlete at the time in American sports.
Any newspaper reporter who really wanted to know what was going on in the spring would make an appointment with Isaac Murphy.
He was brilliant and very much an intellectual. He gave these long, endless interviews. So that was one of the reasons the press loved him. He was a great copy.
Murphy was also a great judge of pace, and his dramatic off-the-pace style came to be known as the gallery, or grandstand finish. He battled weight problems throughout his career, but in 1890 he charged from last place aboard Riley to become the first jockey to win the Kentucky Derby twice. The next year, Murphy rode Kingman and became the first to win the Derby 3 times, a record he held or shared for 55 years. Also in 1890, Murphy participated in a historic match race at Sheepshead Bay Racetrack in New York. He rode the Suburban Handicap winner and Horse of the Year Salvador for owner James Ben Ali Hagan. His opposition was Tenney, ridden by Edward Snapper Garrison.
Murphy always used the English seat, sitting straight upright, and Snapper Garrison is crouched down in what they called the American seat, crouched over. This was an incredible race. The whole country was following it, so to speak, when the newspapers the next day. No radio, no television. So they're really dying to find out about this race because it was set up as the match of the century. If there was like a Tom Durkin to call this race, he probably would have lost his voice or something.
Murphy and Salvador won the match of the century by a head. Another famous photograph shows the nattily-dressed Murphy celebrating his victory with other horsemen at a clam bake, where champagne was flowing.
He had a fondness for champagne. Now, the extent to which this added to what was already problems with an abundance of calories, we can't really tell yet.
A few weeks later, Murphy rode a favorite at Monmouth in another major race.
And when they got to the finish, Murphy was nowhere in sight. He was way behind, and he struggled to the finish and fell off the horse. And this was, if you can imagine, today's leading act is happening to somebody like Tiger Woods or somebody, fell into a heap on the ground off the horse and was suspended.
Whether Murphy had been drinking, was weak from binge dieting, or was poisoned as he claimed, his career was never quite the same. 6 years later, Isaac Murphy was dead at age 35. His death was widely attributed to a reported drinking problem.
On his death certificate, pneumonia is listed as a cause, but there were some complications, undoubtedly, that were related to the purging, the flipping that he engaged in to try to keep his weight down.
More than 60 years later, a search for Murphy's grave ensued, sparked by Keeneland Library historian Amelia Buckley, who believed that published reports of Murphy's burial in New Orleans were inaccurate. The frustrating 3-year search was carried out by Lexington journalist Frank Borries.
They did some extensive research and located his grave at an African American cemetery in the east part of Lexington that had been long abandoned. His story was recaptured and now can be known by generations yet to come.
The remains of at least 9 other black jockeys have been found in the same cemetery, which is being restored and is still known simply as African Cemetery No. 2. Murphy's body was moved twice and now rests at the Kentucky Horse Park in Lexington, next to the grave of another American racing legend, the racehorse Man o' War. The last of the great black jockeys won the Kentucky Derby in back-to-back seasons and nearly won 3 straight. But the saga of Jimmy Winkfield extends far beyond the bluegrass. His was an unprecedented global journey, one of czars and princes, of fortune and squalor, of celebrity and racism. Almost from day one, Winkfield was destined to become a jockey.
He was raised on a farm outside Lexington, and he saw a lot of horses, and he loved horses, and he would jump the fence and ride bareback on some of those horses until he would get caught. And then he was told not to ride, to stay away from them, but he couldn't stay away from horses. They were his love. He was just a natural-born jockey.
Winkfield eventually won the 1901 Derby on His Eminence, the 1902 Derby aboard Allen a Dale, and was a close second in 1903 on the favorite Early. But at the height of Winkfield's American career, he had a disagreement with powerful Kentucky horse owner and breeder John Madden.
Madden felt that he had been double-crossed by Winkfield because Winkfield chose to ride with far a higher bidder.
Madden, as a result, blacklisted Winkfield, whose number of mounts went immediately down.
So my father left after 1903, shortly after that, and he was offered to ride in Russia.
This seems like it's coming out of nowhere, but at the time, American racetracks were in deep trouble, running into debt, horrible trouble, and a lot of the great jockeys, white and black, a lot more white jockeys, in fact, than black jockeys, were going to Europe. They could make more money there. The money was extremely good.
For him, Russia was the very best. He liked Russia very much. He was well received, for one thing, and for his ability, not because of his color or where he came from. And so he was able to really become his true self there.
Wingfield lived in luxury in Tsarist Russia, riding for barons and noblemen and making $100,000 a year, a huge sum in those times. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution, and in 1919, Wingfield had to flee his adopted homeland.
He and a Polish nobleman, but mainly Wingfield, who was a great manager, led the entire racing community out of Odessa with 200 thoroughbreds, men, women, and children in the racing community, heading toward Poland, but going through a bit of Hungary, part of Czechoslovakia, past the Transylvanian Alps, 1,000 miles on foot.
It was difficult finding food and sleeping at night outdoors. A lot of time, you know, when the weather was good, it wasn't bad, but when the weather was bad, it wasn't good.
An incredible sojourn across Eastern Europe to Poland, and made it.
And his life was good, but he wasn't too happy. He wanted to move to France.
In France, Wingfield settled in Maison Lafitte and was a celebrity. He rode until 1930, when he was about 48 years old. After an estimated 2,600 winners in America and tracks throughout Europe, he retired because he was becoming cross-eyed.
He attributes it to the fact when he was in Chicago, and it was during the bootlegs session or the time, he got hold of some bad liquor. I mean, this is what he thinks did it. Actually, we don't know.
Wingfield switched to training horses and did well, but again, fate interrupted.
He was always being chased around by wars, the Nazis threatening Paris. So he got out before the Nazis, the same way he had gotten out ahead of the Bolsheviks. And with the same feeling, when the Bolsheviks came, he said, this ain't no fit place for a little boy from a little colored man from Charlesburg, Kentucky to be.
In France, Wingfield had married a woman from a prominent Russian family in exile, and they escaped back to the U.S. with a son and daughter. While World War II raged in Europe, he quietly trained horses in the East, living briefly in Charlestown, West Virginia.
This is where I'm from, and it's a racetrack town. And he stayed right up around the corner from where I lived, in the section of town. Well, you know, we were youngsters, and at that age, you know, we couldn't relate to black jockeys winning the Kentucky Derby. That, you know, just kind of blew our mind. You know, he would tell us little things about riding in Europe and training horses. And he named some of the horses, you know, that he liked, and a horse named Alan Adale. He would talk about that horse all the time. And sometime, you know, we'd go up there and we said, "Hi, Mr. Wingfield." We said, "Alan Adale." He said, "That was the horse."
Wingfield's son Robert also became a trainer, and after the war, they returned to France and started over.
There was no racism as we know it here in this country. No. In France, you were looked upon as an American, an Englishman, an Italian, or Russian, or whatever country you came from, where your passport showed this is what you were.
Hobbled with arthritis and other health problems, Wingfield returned in 1961 to revisit the U.S. and racism.
Sport Illustrated magazine had heard that he was here, and they came to interview him. That's when they wrote this article about 80 years around the world.
The article was published just prior to that year's Kentucky Derby and caught the attention of the National Turf Riders Association.
The Turf Riders invited him to a dinner at the Brown Hotel, the great legendary Brown Hotel.
So I took him, and we had the address of the Brown's Hotel, and when we got there, the doorman wouldn't let us in.
He's black. He's the guest. He won the Kentucky Derby.
Kentucky was still pretty segregated at the time, and ultimately someone recognized him and intervened so that he was able to walk through the front doors.
But it was a sad, really, turn of events for the two-time winner of the Kentucky Derby.
Wingfield continued to visit his daughter in Cincinnati each winter until his death in 1974. He was thought to be 91 years old.
He knew when he was going because he wrote me and he told my husband, "Come see me before spring because it'll be too late after that." So he died March 23rd. But he lived a full life, In fact, he told my husband, "You'll never live as good a life as I have lived."
When we think of Mr. Winkfield and some of these other, jockeys, that you have to remember them for two things. Not only for the accomplishments on the racetrack, but he should also be remembered for sheer determination.
Jimmy Winkfield's 1902 Kentucky Derby victory was the last by an African-American jockey. Blacks almost vanished from the saddle.
There were a number of factors that happened. One was outright racism. There was nothing wrong with, in the lights of those times, with excluding people.
The absence of African American men as jockeys and in the saddle are a vestige of a form of discrimination and exclusion that began in the early part of the century.
It's difficult to underestimate the real effect of the Ku Klux Klan as it swept through Kentucky. The jobs disappeared, and blacks retreat to positions where they are safe, and we lose that talent pool.
I think it'll be tougher today because it's not that easy to find African Americans interested because they are living in cities and they're following other sports.
African American jockeys won half of the first 28 runnings of the Kentucky Derby. But for 79 years, not a single black jockey even had a mount in a Triple Crown race. That drought ended with the 2000 Derby.
Carroll, ridden by Marlon St. Julian. He will become the first African-American jockey in the Kentucky Derby since Henry King in 1921.
That day, specifically that day, Derby Day, my stomach's like knotted up, and I see all these people and they're cheering, and then it kind of gets a little quiet and they start playing the music. And it's like, I had chills from my toes to the top of my head, man. And I bust out into tears because it's like, man, I finally made it to the Derby.
Down the stretch they come in the Derby. Wheel away takes command by a hit.
Riding for an Arab sheikh from Dubai, Marlon St. Julian finished a respectable 7th in his breakthrough mount.
Like, I never looked at myself as specifically like stereotyping myself as a black rider or African American rider. Just looked at myself as a rider, and I still do.
But although the racial climate has changed for the better in the American sports world, it remains unlikely that African American jockeys will ever again be as commonplace as a century ago. In 1990, Louisville community activist Shirley Mae Beard founded a banquet to honor the memory of black jockeys.
No one knew about the black jockeys, and they kept the history, was just stored away. Nobody thought to bring it out. There are people from the African-American community that even now it's something that they're really proud of.
I think the role of African Americans in horse racing, the historic role, is enormously important, not only because African Americans were forced out of the sport, but also because they were written out of its history. And to write them back into its history now, to sort of rediscover their role, is to give encouragement to people all over the country and to young people all over the country that we didn't discover diversity. It was there before. It's all the more admirable now because it was there in the beginning.
I was never really educated as far as the history of horse racing until probably a few years ago now. It made me want to strive more for my goals, just kind of learning that, because now, well, I know to myself that African Americans did succeed in the sport. Man, there were some great riders in those times.
He regretted that there were no more black jockeys after him. Now, of course, we've had some that are riding now, but they're not still very famous. But who knows? They might become. Let's hope so anyway.
They did not quit. They did not give up. And I think that a lot of our young people could learn a lesson from that.